Yes, here we go.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is ARMA, New Jersey's February educational section, and we want to thank you all for joining us. Like you, we continue to live in a virtual world, and it works, and we're glad to do it. Joining us today, I'm happy to tell you, is Kristen Liston. Kristen is managing principal and founder of Rethink Compliance. Kirsten and I became friends a few years ago at a conference in Europe. We met on the elevator and wound up having breakfast together. Kirsten has for more than 20 years worked in Fortune 500 and Global 2000 companies on strategies to reduce ethics and compliance risk, reputational risk, and she's specializes in the development of business conduct programs. Rethink Compliance was founded with a single goal to create products that give us better, more effective tools to drive behavior and cultural change. So Kirsten is a former journalist and a lawyer, I should point out. She has been published all over the place, most recently in Compliance and Ethics Magazine, Compliance and Ethics Professional, Compliance Week, and in 2019 authored a book, Creating Great Compliance Training in a Digital World, How to Reach and Persuade Your Audience. So Kirsten, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn things over to you. During this session, I'll monitor the chat. If anybody has questions, please feel free to put them in there, and in an opportune moment, I will jump in and get your questions answered for you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Jackie. Well, I was so glad for the invitation to come and speak to ARMA. Jackie told me a little bit about your organization. And as I was saying to, just a minute ago, I love talking about what we're going to talk about today, which is how to create training and other materials that are really going to reach and persuade people. Frankly, people who are digital natives in the 21st century, that's a hurdle a lot of us have to overcome. My general background has been focused on general corporate compliance, but when I read the different kind of subject matter areas that you're focused on, records management, information governance, IT, security, privacy, e-discovery, we really share a lot of the same goals, which is that we have to get through to our audience about topics that are sometimes nuanced, sometimes complex, sometimes technical. They're usually not at the center of the jobs of the audience that we're trying to reach. And we can have a little bit of hurdle of disinterest or I'm too busy or whatever to overcome. Like Jackie said, she and I met at a compliance conference. It was great. We rode the elevator down together and then both walked to the breakfast area, at which point she said, do you want to have breakfast? And we have been hanging out at compliance conferences ever since. So anyway, yes, I'm excited to talk about keeping training up to date in the 21st century. Jackie already gave you my background, but I figured I'd show you a picture of my book. I have been in compliance since September of 2000. I moved into it from journalism. So the through line in my career has been an interest in words, an interest in communication, and interested in getting through to an audience. And for better or for worse, I've never been able to stop writing compliance training courses, even as my career progressed. So I've written more than 700 on all kinds of topics, including some of the topics that you all work in, from records to privacy to information security, that kind of thing. I've also written a lot of policies and codes of conduct. And there's an organization in our industry, the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and they approached me in 2018 to ask if I'd write a book about compliance training. So I was really honored to do that, and that came out in August of 2019. Jackie mentioned our business, Rethink. We're a certified woman-owned business. We have been woman-owned and led from the earliest days of the organization, but to get that little logo, you have to go through a long process to prove it. So last year, when we slowed down a little bit, thanks to the pandemic, we went through that process to do it. So that's it. So today's focus is, I tried to think about what that I think about would be of interest to the people who are on this webinar and part of this organization. And I think we all share the question of, how do you get people's attention in a noisy digital world? And how do you make training stick when communicating with modern audiences, especially on technical, complex topics that can't always just be boiled down to a slogan or a tagline or something like that? For myself, because I started doing compliance training 20 years ago. These questions, especially the last 8 years, and I'll tell you a little bit of that story, especially the last 8 years, these questions are what have been kind of driving my professional life and ultimately led me to start a company. Because, it's one thing to meet a requirement. We need records training. We need information security training. Okay, check, did it. We need a policy. We need to communicate with people. It's another thing to actually create something that gets through to your audience, gets them to pay attention, gets them to care, gets them to take action. And it's surprisingly hard to do. So I'm going to kind of take you on the journey I've been on with this and some of the things I've investigated that have led me to certain ideas, conclusions, inspirations about how to approach this. I will say I love hearing from people. I know Jackie's monitoring the chat. The way I have my computer set up on presenter view, I won't see your chats come in, but I welcome Jackie. If you see a question, please feel free to jump in, put yourself on video and ask the question. And then as we go, oh, go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Cool. And then as we go, also, there will be times when I'll ask the, people who are listening, like, what do you think about this? Or what ideas do you have? Please feel free to join in the chat. Different groups have different cultures. So if you have a chatting culture, awesome. If you don't have a discussion in the chat culture, that's fine too. But I welcome you to engage with, with the audience and with each other. And I'll read the chat when I'm done too. So I'll catch up on everything that got said. So my journey, kind of the break point in my career, to answer some of the questions we're going to talk about today, the first really important date for me is like 2013. At that point, I had been in the compliance space for 13 years. I'd been doing a lot of training. I had moved for a time into an advisory role, and I was at a company that really grew up with the compliance training industry. It was founded essentially in the early 2000s, and it had grown and matured, and it had about 300 clients. So Fortune 500 companies, Global 2000 companies. But an interesting thing was happening. 15 or so years into the development of corporate compliance training programs, the products that had worked and that the industry was built on, that were created in 2000, 2003, 2005, those kind of approaches and technologies had become the foundation of this industry. And by 2013, clients were kind of getting tired of it. And so the company I was at actually created a product strategy role. They said to me, go out and invent the next generation of compliance training. And so that was my charter. And so what I started doing is I called up the sales department and I called up the client services department. And I said, every time you have a client conversation where you think it would be useful, invite me, because I just want to start asking people questions. I want to hear what they're going to say. And I did that, like learning from the market what they wanted. I then went off and looked at tools and technologies. I then made prototypes and started bringing them back to people. That was kind of how I was trying to invent the next thing. But what was really interesting was from early in those conversations, something started to happen again and again, which is that I'd show up to, a global automotive company or a big pharmaceutical company or a soup company or something like that. And we'd meet with the compliance person and they would know I was there because I was interested in what they wanted to see next in compliance. And it kept happening that they would bring something and say, can't you do something like this for us? And I have some screenshots here, but up on the upper left was a safety video that New Zealand Air did, right? It was around 2013. So it was right around the time the Lord of the Rings movie came out. The New Zealand Air actually had the actors from, Lord of the Rings create their safety video, and they made it interesting. People watched it. And the person said, I found myself watching the airline safety video. We're kind of like airline safety. Why can't we do something like this? Obviously not hire the Lord of the Rings cast, but something interesting. Up on the top right, there was a PSA published in Britain all about like choking awareness and what to do if a baby's choking. And it was funny because they basically, the characters were things that could choke a baby. And they were voiced by famous actors, probably, working pro bono or something like that. But it was enjoyable and it taught something. Here are the things that can choke a baby. So keep it away from a baby. And then what to do if a baby's choking. There were political ads. And then the one that was in the one in the bottom right, a woman quit her job like at 4:30 in the morning. She worked for a video production company. She was 24 and she hated her boss. And so she filmed herself dancing through the company's offices. And the person said to me, she made this for free. Like because she was quitting her job. Like if a 24-year-old who's quitting their job can make a video that I found interesting and went viral online, with all the money we're spending on compliance training, can't we do something like that? So that was really the founding study. And you heard enough of those, and it made me realize things. And I'll boil it down into two observations, and then I'll kind of show the path that I went to explore it. So the thing that was obvious to me, and this was true in 2013, it is still true today. As information consumers, in a relatively short amount of time, we've changed our expectations for content. And that's all thanks to the internet. I started my journalism career in the 90s when it was really common to have 7,000 word articles in a magazine. You don't see that anymore. Companies used to send out multi-page memos, kind of in this corporate boilerplate voice of God. Those have gone away, or if they haven't gone away, they're not the main kind of example of content that we see. And so we tend to be online, and people online skim rather than read. And so there's a thing called screen and glean. You go to something, you quickly see what's important, and then you move on. And a lot of internet content has been optimized for that quick, like screen, glean, move on, screen, glean, move on. It's also just the case that we're flooded with information. And so we've become very, very efficient information processors. We look at something, gauge if it's relevant to us, and we move on. And everything looks nice and it's well designed. And in fact, if it's on the internet, it's designed to catch our attention and pull us in. So we read differently, we interact with content differently. And then as the tools and technologies have developed, we have higher expectations for how content will perform, what it'll look like. And all this, in my mind, is competition for any content, even mandatory, including compliance or risk-related messages. So that's the first thing. But then it has also occurred to me, and this was kind of a second aha, that kind of information alone doesn't do it. And right around this time, I was taking a bunch of online courses because I was just trying to figure out what's this new way of communicating in the world? How should I be thinking about the modern digital learner, that kind of thing. And I encountered a lot of behavioral economics, a lot of people writing about that stuff. And it's become very popular to think about those concepts these days. So a lot of them are mainstream. People write books about them. Malcolm Gladwell writes articles around them. But I kind of had this realization that, like, what are we really doing when we make training and policies? What is our real goal? And I think in maybe the early days of compliance, the early days of risk communication, like we literally had to inform people. In some cases, they did not know that the company had a code of conduct, that there was a records retention policy, what a conflict of interest is, how to follow the information security guidelines. There was a certain amount of informing that had to happen. But in 2013, when I was kind of getting my thoughts together, I realized, well, if just informing them was enough, we'd kind of be done. Like everybody who's a professional and has been working for a couple of years, they're informed. The problem is they forget they're informed. They think it doesn't apply. They think it's inconvenient, all that stuff. And I realized all this training and policy communication isn't, the end goal really isn't to inform people, it's to persuade them. And if information alone isn't enough, if you kind of have to do more with it, well, then making something mandatory only takes it part of the way. I mean, I come out of the e-learning world where you can put in all kinds of safeguards, page timers, you're required to click on everything. If someone doesn't want to pay attention, they don't have to pay attention. You know, these days people can watch a cat video on their phone or surf the web or talk to their sister or whatever and just click through something. So if the goal isn't just information, but persuading people, it's kind of a higher bar. But then I also realized, well, the good news is there's a whole industry that got there ahead of us. I mean, advertising has been going big since at least the middle of the last century. There are content marketing techniques that people use all over the web. And there's other research, some of what we'll talk about today, including research into learning. So maybe it's possible to kind of look at the research into like how we think, how we learn, how we agree, how we remember, how we're persuaded, how we decide. And maybe there's something in there from compliance training. So those were kind of the instigating insights. So there are two things we'll look at. The first is, what can we learn from advertising? What does advertising know that we don't? And this came directly from that insight that the challenge isn't really informing people, but persuading people, because advertising doesn't really seek to inform. You know, Coca-Cola doesn't just want you to be informed that there's soda in the world, and theirs has a certain quality and you can order it at a restaurant. Coca-Cola isn't just informing you. They want to make their drink the drink of choice, what you think about when you show up. And so what can we learn from that? And so one of the things I started thinking about is it's really hard to change human behavior. It's like just trying to change our own behavior. Right now it is, what is it? It's February 10th or something, right? Apparently January 17 to 21 is the day that most New Year's resolutions go to die. Like people who start January 1 and say, I'm going to quit smoking this year, or this is the year I'm going to run a marathon, or, no grains or sugar for me for a month, or whatever it is. Out of all the people who set New Year's resolutions, a huge amount of them abandon them within 3 weeks. And then I wonder if anybody has a guess. Feel free to put it in the chat. I won't be able to see it, but you can guess and then see how close it gets. But how many people who make a New Year's resolution that professors have studied, do you think get to the end of the year having done it? Do you think it's double digits? Do you think it's single digits? Do you think it's 70? Well, we already said 75% abandon them. Well, the answer is 8. Apparently 8% of people who make New Year's resolutions, who decide on their own to change their own behavior, only get to the end of the year, only 8% do it. Well, okay, but maybe it's not life or death. That's not that serious. I want to run a marathon, but you know what? A ice cream sundae tastes pretty good. Okay, that's fine. Nobody's really harmed. So then they looked at a study of people who had a sudden cardiac event, the kind of thing that makes you hospitalized, gives you a real wake-up call, people who had some type of cardiac event and were then given recommendations, lifestyle modifications, medication, that kind of thing. And then they monitored people's compliance rate. And you would think, well, I would think it has to be at least double that. You just had a wake-up call. It's your heart. Your heart is important. No, it turns out about 10% of people are compliant on the whole. It is hard to change your own behavior. So if it's hard to change your own behavior, it's pretty hard to change other people's behavior. So that was what got me started thinking about advertising, content marketing, and also groups that have had massive social influence, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or public smoking. When I was in college in the 90s, everybody smoked, and everybody smoked inside. You smoked in dorm rooms, you smoked in clubs. These days, I can't remember the last time I saw somebody smoking inside. I can't remember the last time I saw a restaurant with a smoking section. And it wasn't just being informed that smoking was bad. We knew that in the 1950s and 60s. It was influencing and persuading people. Jackie, I just saw you pop up. Were there any questions in the chat? No. Okay.
Nope.
I just
figured I'd come back in, that's all.
Oh, good. No, the videos change around, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't steamrolling anything. So a key principle in advertising is to not start with what you want to say, but to start with your audience. And I've learned this because at Rethink, for our head of creative services, we hired somebody who came out of advertising. And it's been really fascinating to watch her brain work, because as much as I've thought about communication and think about getting through to people, she's trained in a whole thing that isn't second nature to me. And so in compliance training, when you say, I'm going to write a bribery course, I'm going to write an information protection course, I'm going to write a records course, in compliance, what you typically start with is, okay, what do I want to tell them? In advertising, what you start with is, who's my audience? Where are they? What matters to them? And how can I move them closer to where I want them to be in terms of and on the playing field of what matters to them, which is really interesting. So one thing I have to keep reminding myself is, it's not what I say, it's what the audience takes away. And that's a different way of thinking, because I can give them a lot of information, but if it's dense, if it's hard to digest, if it doesn't feel relevant, if it doesn't, feel like something that matters in their daily life, or if it feels like something they can skip now, they will. So I might have done a great job defining things and writing the perfect words, but if when they get it, they don't do anything with it, that their takeaway is not useful to me. So it can be really useful to start with your customer and what they care about. And quite frankly, what you want them to know, what you want them to feel, what you want them to walk away remembering. And that's it's kind of a different way to go about it. The other thing is, and I've read this as a principle of marketing, it's true of advertising, the further a message has to go, the simpler it should be. It doesn't mean you can't at some point convey the details, because quite frankly, there are important details to know and not all of them can be oversimplified, but it can really help to make a simple message, to make sure what your audience is taking away is that simple message. We'll actually talk about that a little bit on the next screen. And we've already talked about that, about the final bullet, but telling somebody isn't enough. You haven't necessarily accomplished your goal if you told somebody. You actually want to take some steps to ensure understanding, to not only create the communication, not only deliver it, but on the other end say, did it get through? And you can do that in formal or informal ways. You know, you can ask people, you can do surveys, you can do tests, you can do that kind of thing. But it's kind of a thought process to start with your audience, try and make it as simple as possible for them, and then check to see how it got through. And something I also think can be really useful in this area is to do the work for your learner. I know, at least speaking for compliance, you know, the people who go into compliance tend to be really comfortable with large amounts of information. You know, you give them a 200-page PowerPoint on antitrust laws, and they read it through very sincerely and very earnestly. They think hard about who is this for? What do they need to know? What are the takeaways? And they come to the end of the PowerPoint, and usually they're like, okay, thanks for that. I understand the background. I understand the takeaways. I'm going to go put this into action. The average person, though, isn't that comfortable with information. I don't know if anybody else on the webinar is like me. I seek out information. I'm always reading. I'm always whatever. And I read this personality type study, and I'm a questioner under it. But they said, you know, you're a questioner if you're always sending other people articles. So I started asking people in my life, do I send you a lot of articles? And my business partners were like, we just file them. Like, it's way too much for us to read. So I am also someone who's comfortable with a lot of information, but I have to remind myself that the average person isn't. And the average person, especially if it's not their area of interest, and if they don't already have a keen interest in the subject, they're not going to take the time to digest, why am I getting this big, you know, big pile of information? What does it mean to me? What do I have to do with it? So what I recommend that you do is you start off by connecting people to, why does this matter? And to get really clear on it. I think sometimes when we work in a subject area and we know why it's important, we think, well, everybody knows that. Like, why do you need to keep why do you need good passwords? Someone could hack your computer and take all your bank information. They could steal our client list. A competitor could get our pricing. It can seem obvious the why, but we often don't do enough conveying it to other people, and we often don't do enough connecting it to a why that we're sure matters to them. The average person, they might not care if a competitor gets a hold of our pricing, but they may care very much if, like, the whole company knew that they lost some secret data, right? So it's kind of like, what about this is important to them? And then I think it's useful to think about a lot of our training and messaging like an executive summary. And, you know, why do executive summaries exist? They exist because executives are busy. They need someone who's smart and informed to dig into the issue. They need that person to figure out what's important, figure out what the key choices are, kind of brief them on all that stuff, and then make some recommendations. The executive ultimately has to make the decision, and it's up to them to make sure they have enough information to do that. But with that kind of briefing and background, usually the executive is, you know, prepared to make an informed decision pretty quickly, without having to do all the background research themselves, including in areas where they might be an amateur or not as up to speed. And to me, that sounds like a great analogy, both for compliance and then the type of functions that the ARMA folks are, ARMA, sorry, I said it wrong, ARMA folks are in that, you know, you're smart and informed, you know the rules, the red flags, the warning signs, the pitfalls, you know all the regulations and the company policies and that stuff, and you know why you're giving this guidance. But your audience is busy. And quite frankly, if the company's lucky, they're focused on doing their job well. So it can really be good for us to make it super easy for these busy, kind of distracted people to understand, what is this issue? Why does it matter to me? What are my choices here? And what's the right call? And I also think that taking this approach shows a lot of respect for your audience. You're kind of saying, I respect that you're busy. I'm going to try and make this as easy as possible, not simpler than it needs to be, but as simple as it can be. And it also makes it much easier for them to take away exactly the message that you want to send. Oh, and I'll say the last bullet point. I always, years ago, I was working with an attorney at a company, and we kept turning in this short, really tightly written content, and she would make it this long, and then we would edit it down, preserving all the substantive points, and send it back, and she'd make it this long. So I was having a conversation with her kind of about what we're talking about preparing your material for absorption to the client, making something that's plain language, making stuff that's easy to digest. And this lawyer, who was incredibly smart, said to me, Kirsten, I am on board with everything you're saying, but I just have a question. Are you saying what I wrote is not plain language? Because to me, it's like, it's the simplest thing in the world. And I was like, it's the simplest thing in the world, but it's 1,200 words and your audience can take in about 200, your average audience. So it's well written for you. Now you have to write something that's good for your audience. So resist the urge to embellish, because that's often where this comes from. You get something boiled down to clear guidance, and then you think, ooh, but this is an important point. Ooh, but this is more, and you wind up adding stuff back in. So do the work for your learner, digest it, try and develop clear takeaways. Think of it like an executive summary, and then try not to add anything back in. It will be hard, or at least it is for me. So, and then I also want to say clear, simple, and frequent can do a lot. We sometimes want to fix the challenge of reaching people and the severity of risk with volume. We think, oh, this is really important, so I'm going to tell them a lot of stuff. So I think it's useful to think about advertising and say, little bits of stuff that catches our attention and engages us and gets a quick message through, it can do a lot, and a lot of big brands, including the ones that, also have compliance training programs and also have records programs and information security programs and things like that. When they do their public face, they're willing to do this. It can sometimes feel a little risky to do it when they're doing risk education, and yet human beings are human beings. The advertising is created this way kind of for maximum attractability for human beings. So it's worth thinking about how can those principles apply to the stuff I'm working on. So that was my first area of exploration, was what can we learn from advertising? I also think it's useful to look into what do we know about learning? Because there's a lot of, we live in a great age of what I'll call sociological research, where there has been some science put behind how people think, how they decide, how they learn. So I think it's worth learning about this, because again, if it's not what we say, but what people take away, how can we engineer kind of tactics that are designed to make something stick? There's a good, I'll connect it to make it stick in a second. And one of the things I was thinking about is how useful is compliance training really? There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal right around this time that was called "So Much Training, So Little to Show for It." And what the Wall Street Journal said was US companies spend $156 billion every year on corporate training. But they said, but what's true about corporate training is there's often little practical follow-up. There are often few meaningful assessments. A lot of times you have assessments to show everybody got 100%, or at least that at one point was a trend. So the estimate was that 90% of skills are lost within 1 year. And that actually tracked with my experience. I was making a lot of training and we were making it to the best of our ability. But there wasn't, and there was more compliance awareness, especially for the fact that in the past, people hadn't even been informed on this stuff. They were more familiar with it. But given how much we were doing and how much companies were spending, it didn't seem like we were really having the impact we wanted. So I read a book, and you'll see the book on the next screen, but it's a book based on research into learning by two professors and then a journalist who helped them write it well. And what they say is, most learning strategies provide only the illusion of mastery. We think we know it. But so what is the illusion of mastery? I will say, does anybody know which of these are actually what a penny looks like? This is included in the book, and it's a really interesting thing where you think you know something. And then sometimes when you put it to the test, you realize, I don't know. So I'll say in the chat, is there a consensus? Does anybody know which of these is actually correct for what a penny looks like?
We've only got one response so far, and they've selected A.
Yeah,
A again, we got another A.
cool.
Okay, it's not a long answer. You only have to put one letter in there.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. And yep. But it was interesting when somebody gave this to me, the
Somebody
book
came in with I,
is I. Yep, yep.
J,
Mm-hmm.
not A. Okay, I think we're slowing down a bit.
Yeah. And you know what it is? It's E.
Wow.
And I know the first time that I got that, I was like, oh, like when someone showed this to me, I realized I didn't know what a penny looked like. But if you would have said to me, can you pick a penny out of a lineup? I would have said, yeah. So there's this book. It's called Make It Stick: The Science of Successful Learning. It's by two professors and then a journalist who happens to be the brother-in-law of one of the professors. And I actually got to know one of the authors, a guy named Henry Rodiger. He goes by Roddy, as a part of a cybersecurity initiative I was working on that brought him in. But the whole purpose of this book is these two professors set out to study learning. And they said, it turns out most of the strategies we intuitively assume work aren't actually as effective as we think they are. And there are some things we don't think are effective or we assume wouldn't be effective that are. So I'm going to talk about 4 findings because I think they're relevant to the type of thing that we do. And the first one, it's so intuitive when you think about it. But what they say is one of the best ways to drive learning is to force people to remember it, not just once, but a bunch of times. And like I say, it's intuitive. Since the 1800s and before then, just through common sense, we realize there's this thing called a forgetting curve. And we lose a lot of things quickly. And then the little that we hold on to falls away more slowly. And honestly, anybody who's been human or had a brain or a memory knows that. You'll remember this talk a lot better 2 minutes after it ends than 2 weeks from now. But an interesting thing that they articulated and that other learning science has articulated is to improve learning, you have to interrupt the forgetting curve. You have to help people stop forgetting. And one thing they found is that fast learning leads to fast forgetting. If you've ever crammed for an exam and then taken the exam and then thought about the topic a week later, you don't know a lot. Like you learned a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. You demonstrated that you knew it, and then it went away. I will say that in compliance training for a long time, that was the way compliance training was done. You'd get annual compliance training, you'd take a test to prove that you knew it, and then people wouldn't hear from the compliance department again for a year. In a lot of ways, the industry has moved away from that towards more regular communication. But what these guys say in this book, and it's a great read because it was in part written by a journalist, not just by academics. They say retrieval is like exercise for a memory, and there's a common theme throughout this. The more you make your brain work, the more learning sticks. So retrieval is like exercise for your memory. And to be most effective, you can have people retrieve something once, but in fact, if you have them retrieve it a couple of times, it strengthens the memory each time. It's kind of like there's a forgetting curve. Oh, and I had to remember. And there's a forgetting curve. Oh, and I had to remember. Plus, if you know you're going to have to remember this, you're going to keep that in the 30% of what you hold on to and lose more slowly than in the 70%. So repeated retrieval can make skills a reflex. The brain acts before the mind has time to think. So when you think about things where we need to teach people kind of a just in case thing that they need to apply in their daily lives, you want them to respond almost without thinking, in which case repeated retrieval is a good way to do it. And what they said is even a single test in class can produce a large improvement in final exam scores, and gains in learning increase as the number of tests increase. So I'll say this, and feel free to put ideas in the chat. I read this and I say, how would I put this into practice? And what I think immediately is we need to test people more often. And it doesn't have to be big, long tests. It doesn't have to be arduous. We don't have to annoy people. But it also taught me that testing can be learning. So you don't always have to create a new piece of training or a new policy to tell people stuff. One way to reinforce learning is tell them, and then a little bit later, ask them to tell you. And then a little bit later, ask them to tell you. And then a little bit later, ask them to tell you, and then maybe train them again. There's that phrase, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Just because we can produce training doesn't mean training that broadcast is the best kind of training. Sometimes testing can be a good piece of, can be good training. So that was interesting to me.
Kristen, it's Jackie.
Yeah.
One of the things I've heard recommended, and I haven't yet tried it myself, is to send out just a little 1 or 2 question survey to your employees
Yeah.
on the topic to see if they're actually recalling the training that you've run previously.
Yeah. I think that's such a great idea. And, we've started to use training to collect analytics so that people, and when I say analytics, it's just a fancy word for saying collect information from learners that the company can use to inform its program. But one thing we'll do is say, have you given a gift in the last year? And then if they have, we'll say, what's our gift limit? Who do you have to go to for approval on that? And it's interesting. Yeah, it's a great point, Jackie, to just say, do you know this stuff? And it does, in 1, 2 questions, it doesn't have to be hard. This next one applies both to learning and other forms, like mental learning and other forms of practice. They found it most actually with baseball players. Most people think if you want to learn something, you should focus on it. Like, I have to do this webinar, so I'm going to just focus on it for the next 3 days and do the webinar, or I have to take this test, so I'm going to focus on it. What they found is that actually, like, and it's the same thing about making the forgetting curve happens. So the further you are into forgetting it, and then you're required to do something, the stronger it is. So what they found is that by mixing stuff up, like in practice, you don't just throw curveballs. It's baseball player. You throw, I might be out of baseball terms, but you throw different kinds of pitches. If you practice different kinds of pitches, you actually get better at all of them than if you just focus one thing to exclusion and focus one thing to exclusion. So research shows that spacing out.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
from Scott Bowker, he said, if you provide real life examples of compliance failure, that resonates more with him.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I totally agree. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you can use it as a basis for questions or just tell people about it, but that really helps make it relevant. So mix up your training, mix up things. So you improve more quickly with single focus learning, but you forget more quickly too. Spacing out practice or spacing out learning can feel less productive because you're encouraging forgetting in between. But when you encourage forgetting and then the person has to remember something, it actually leads to more durable learning. So I just say that to say, when you're thinking about training on your topic, you could train on it all at once in a year. And I'll go to, how would you put this into practice? You could think about training on it once a year, but what if you train on it, let a little time go by, make people go back, like train on it again, but make them recall something, let a little time go by, make them recall something. So following up training with testing can drive learning, but spacing out your training can actually drive learning too, because it's forcing people to recall this thing and ultimately making the memory stronger. So this next thing, which product gives you wings? Anybody recognize that slogan? Or if there's a meal and you're loving it, where'd you get it from? Or you want to play sports and you want to just do it. Like, do you recognize the phrases that those come from? And again, we're going back to the whole thing of advertising. Red Bull gives you wings. McDonald's, I'm loving it. Just do it. What these guys found is that you can encode information that you're imparting to people for maximum retrieval. What they say is there's almost no limit to what we can learn. Like, everything goes into our brain and hangs out there. But what is limited is the index to our brain. So if you've ever said in a conversation, I know it, but I just can't think of what it is, that actually describes a real phenomenon. That information is in your brain, but you've kind of lost, like, the library card catalog, like, here's where you can go find it on the shelf. And I found this really interesting. So when you forget something, it's often not the knowledge itself that you forget the cues that let you retrieve it. And your brain is extraordinarily efficient. So it's throwing out old cues all the time so you can replace them with new ones. So it's just kind of like this, like, assembly line where your cues go through and then like they fall off into the garbage unless there's some reason to remember it.
Kirsten, we have a comment from Angel Ramos.
Yeah.
I heard that changing methods of learning helps memory, reading out loud, changing locations. Yes.
Yes, that's because you're changing stuff up. And anytime you change something up, people pay more attention, right? It's kind of like you re-engage them. So it's totally true. It's that you're interrupting. There's a forgetting curve. I'll also say there's a boredom curve. And so anytime you can interrupt forgetting or boredom, anytime you can do something novel, it's more memorable. So all that helps. It's totally true. Um, and this, for somebody who, creates training, creates webinars like this, creates policies, this is interesting to me, because what it is you can create information that by design is easier to remember. So we've all heard of mnemonic devices, but they're mental tools that kind of cue information for easier retrieval, and they're rhymes, taglines like gives you wings, I'm loving it, that kind of thing, vivid imagery, acronyms. I'm going to see if I can remember this now, but the pilots, when they're taught to fly, learn acronyms, and there are some acronyms that describe a series of things they need to do that they might not use for 20 years, or hopefully they'll never use. But something goes wrong with the aircraft and they think like A, B, C, D, E, and they have a word for each of those things, and there's an association, and they teach pilots these acronyms because they don't know when they're going to need it, but when they need it, they don't have time to look it up in a book. They kind of have to remember all the things that they're doing. We did a series of cybersecurity trainings for a company, and we came up with a tagline: stop and think, don't be the weak link. And every training we rolled out, every video we rolled out, every policy would say that, because if nothing else, we just wanted people to remember that kind of mindset, that like, we don't want you to be the weak link. So like, pause and think whenever you're getting into problems. And what's amazing is when you start looking at mnemonic devices, it can actually organize huge bodies of knowledge for retrieval. Those pilot acronyms might be 4 letters, but it's this huge complicated process. But if you can encode it into something you can remember, it makes it a lot easier to get it. So, what they say is how readily you can recall knowledge from your internal archives is determined by context. So if we were all sitting on this webinar when somebody said something, and then we were all back on a webinar, we might be more likely to remember it than if we were home or in our personal lives or on vacation or something like that. How recent it was, and then how vivid it was. So something I really work on doing a lot in training is thinking about what's vivid, what's going to catch people's attention. And to the point of the person who said about changing format, a change catches people's attention, novelty catches people's attention. If you've always done your privacy training in one way and you do it in a totally different way, it's going to catch people's attention. Even moving from online training to a webinar, or webinar to live training, or different look and feel, different length, just changing things up can make people pay more attention, make it more vivid. So yeah, I already talked about how I would put this into practice. And then this one is interesting too, which is that you can prime the mind for learning. You can set up a situation where someone is much more likely to learn what you want them to learn. And what they found is, and again, like a lot of stuff about memory and learning, this aligns with my personal experience. We all have kind of common sense experience of this, but it turns out you remember a solution better if you've actually struggled with the problem before being shown how to solve it. I once went and sat down with an e-learning vendor that was building their entire company around this one style of training. They haven't made it to corporate compliance yet, so I don't have to worry about them. But it's all what I would call test to learn. You take a test question and then you see how you do. And if you get it right, it just says, yep, you're right. And it's a small amount. If you get it wrong, then you get the learning. And I found that to be really effective. And what they say is setting up situations where the answer is not obvious, where people have to struggle with it, where sometimes you can get it wrong several times, like make unsuccessful attempts. When you do get the answer, there's a lot of deep processing that goes on. And some of it is because we humans are curious animals, and we're like, wait, why is that? And then you have to put all the pieces together to say, why does this make sense? So again, requiring some amount of effort from your audience can be useful. And for me, that was really interesting. Similarly,
Yes, Jennifer, we'll move on. Angel brought up an example that would be familiar to everyone on the call. There's a new mnemonic that ARMA has come out with for their generally accepted record keeping principles, a tip card.
Oh, that's great.
It's transparency, availability, transparency, integrity, protection, compliance, accountability, retention, and disposition.
I
So
love it.
none of us are going to remember that without the mnemonic, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. You wouldn't remember all those words, but once you're like, it's tip card, you could be like, well, what's the T? It's probably transparency. What's the I? It's probably like you can and what we're doing right now is guessing at it, which actually is a powerful way to encode it into memory because you're like, oh, it's not innovation, it's integrity, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I know a company that for their compliance program, they came up with their own values. The company has values, but they came up with values for their compliance program and they turned them into an acronym, and the acronym is I care. And that's, to me, it's great because the message of the acronym is I'm doing this stuff because I care. I care about the company. I care about my career. I care about ethics. I care about integrity. And it helps you remember all those things associated with it. Yeah, and so generating an answer turns out to be more powerful than recalling it, even if you get it wrong at first, because this is how we learn in life. You learn through trial and error, right? And we can think about all the ways we've learned social skills through trial and error. We've advanced our career through trial and error. In my case, starting a company, I put an accounting system in place through trial and error. I had to go through 5 different accountants before I found the right one. And feedback is more powerful when it's a little bit delayed. So what this suggests, or at least what I take away from it, so it's better for learning to solve a problem than to memorize a solution. It's actually better to attempt a solution and get it wrong a couple of times than not to attempt it. So for me, the takeaway is when I think about the topics that the people on the phone represent, they're hard topics. It's not, people aren't going to instantly recall the principles of records management, information governance, privacy, e-discovery. That's okay. For learning's sake, you can actually use it to your advantage. Give people a hard problem to solve. Let them try it a couple of times and then tell them what they got right and tell them what they got wrong. And that's actually a powerful way to learn. Another way to say it is learning doesn't have to be just about you telling people stuff. Learning can be about telling, it can be about testing, it can be about repeating, it can be about reminding, and then it can be about requiring them to struggle with the answer and discuss what they would do and figure out what they would do. And in a way that they're contributing to their own training when they do that. So if I were going to leave you with some takeaways today, and then I'm happy to take questions, discuss, practical applications, brainstorm, that kind of thing. If I were to leave you with 6 things to think about when you put together written materials, when you put together communications, when you put together a strategy for communicating with your audience, is number 1, start with your audience. Who are they? What do they care about? And if the Venn diagram of what they care about and what you care about are 2 separate circles, how can you get those 2 things to overlap? How can you put what you're asking them in terms of something that matters to them? And it requires a little bit of thought. It requires a little bit of creativity. Something in my field that people perennially struggle with is, how do we get salespeople to stop focusing just on closing the deal and pay attention to some warning signs? Well, if the salesperson just cares about closing the deal, if that's their primary motivating factor, maybe don't treat that as competition. Maybe treat that as a place to start. If the salesperson cares about closing the deal, how can their compliance requirements overlap with or support closing the deal? And that gives you at least a place to start. Do the work for your audience as much as you can. Don't just give them the raw information. That works for us. That works for people who are experts in an area, who are interested in an area, who know the ins and outs. But as much as you can, and especially thinking later about those mnemonic devices, as much as you can, think about, how do I distill this down to the takeaways, to what is the absolute minimum they need to know to have basic literacy in this subject? From a behavioral perspective, what do I need them to do or not do? do I need them to seek out information? If so, do they have the information? Like, how can you make it as easy as possible for someone to take away the right message, and get to the right place, in a simplified way? So start with your audience, do the work for them, then make them retrieve it. Once you've told them something, don't, it's, I've heard people say like, oh, well, we have a bribery risk, so we must do bribery training. Okay, we did bribery training. That's good for our bribery risk. Once you've done it, make them prove that you've done it. I mean, in a way, we feel like the burden's on us. How do we make sure that we've gotten through to people? But put the burden on your audience. This is something you're expected to know. So we told you about records. Now prove to us you know it. And by being asked to prove it, and quite frankly, being asked to prove it before they're faced with a real life situation where they need to do something, can help reinforce that and be part of the learning. Mix up topics and spread out your training if you can. I mean, I know everyone is dealing with their own logistics, their own kind of infrastructure. Sometimes we're limited in how often we can touch people. But if you can, try and space out when people hear from you, because then every time they hear from you, it's a little reminder. You get kind of that little bump of attention, that little change of context. Use retrieval cues. I love that tip card. Is there anything that you can make rhyme, make a tagline, make an acronym, just encode it so it's easy for someone to remember? Because what would be ideal is if someone's like, records, I don't know what to do, but tip card, like, at least it gives them a place to start. It lets them know the questions to ask and where to look for information. And then take advantage of the fact that we have complex technical topics and make them solve it. Especially if someone has the ability to look up a job aid, look up the policy. If you've provided people with a lot of information about what to do, force them to use it. Be like, here's a situation, how would you solve it? And then let them use their available resources to do it. And it's okay if people say, that was really hard, I didn't know the answer. Well, that's good. Number one, now you know it better. And number two, like, this stuff isn't always easy. And that's why we provided resources to help you, but also why we need you to pay attention to it. So that is my webinar for today, but I wanted to say thanks everybody for coming, and I'm happy to, we have about 6 minutes left, so I'm happy to take any questions, or if you would like to discuss anything among yourselves, that'd be great too.
So feel free to unmute yourself, guys, and just jump in here. Kirsten's going to remain available to us. And in the interim, I'm going to jump in there and wait for you guys to warm up a bit. I was thinking about your description of the Venn diagram. And without realizing it, I did a workshop right before I got jumped on this call. And I had been doing that without thinking about it, because I was training record coordinators who were going to be the local liaisons on the policy. And I was talking about disposing of electronic data and how nobody wants to do it. It gets too big and you have to do it on a regular basis. But what I said to them was, think about it though. If it takes you 20 minutes to find a document because you have too much, isn't it worth the 10 minutes to clean it up beforehand?
Yeah.
So he's making your life easier by doing what I need you to do.
Yeah.
Right? So thinking about it in that perspective, and you put those things together, you don't think about it in terms of this.
Yeah, there's a lot we do unconsciously, right? Because we know humans, but it's such a good point. She was saying to you, I care about time. Why should I take the time to do it? And you're like, you care about time. Well, wouldn't you like to save the time without having to recreate this thing? So yeah, you were putting it exactly in the terms that matter to her.
Yes, how about giving them time back? Yeah. And then something I think a lot of us on the call do, and we don't think about it as training, is if you're running a disposition event and you're sending out emails around the disposition event, it's an opportunity to remind people. If you have job aids that they can print out and post in their work areas, and you keep them fresh, so they're always printing them out. So there are other ideas for training as well. I love the tagline. My last place, every time I put up a sign, it said hashtag it's up to you.
Oh, I like it.
All had to do about record management and privacy.
I like it. And that's the mindset you want to bring. If all they remember is it's up to me, that's better than nothing, right? Because it's up to me. Okay, what do I do? Oh wait, Jackie made me some job aids. I guess I'll start there.
So there's all different ways to do it, because when we think about frequent training, we think about micro training and things like that. Not all of us have the budget or the time or the buy-in to do that. but there are things we can do at little to no cost and still be training without training, right?
Yeah, I love that. It's such yeah, it's such an important insight. I mean, so many kind of risk area programs, there are limits of time, of money, of people, of resources. So it's like, yeah, how do you be smart about that? And quite frankly, if you can put your audience to work to do some of your job, that's great. So
Yeah. Well, we're getting more compliments coming in than questions, Kirsten. So it seems like you've made a big impact on the audience, and we really do appreciate that. So if there's no questions from the audience, I want to say thank you to Kirsten. And we really appreciate you taking the time out. I know this is not your typical audience, but I knew the content you had would be valuable to all of us. Just on a more personal note, ARMA New Jersey will continue to try and bring you quality educational content, but it's not just us. There's a lot of people on the phone from the regions around us and across the country. If you're not already an ARMA member, please consider becoming one. www.arma.org. You can get information on membership. Perhaps just as importantly, there's a calendar out there. You can keep track of what's going on everywhere. I know personally, I try to attend as many of the different chapter and region webinars as I can because we always need new ideas. I've been in this business a couple of decades, and record management gets stale when you've been doing it for that long. So go out there, look for information from other groups. If you're not a member, consider joining us, and we'd love to have you. So thank you all for participating. Kirsten, it's been an absolute pleasure. And in the interest of full disclosure, Kirsten's also one of my vendors. I'll talk to you in a couple hours.
yeah, sounds good. I'll talk to you then, Jackie. Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kirsten. Great presentation.
Thank you. I really enjoyed presenting. So thank you.